Welcome to the Bend Don't Break podcast. I am Aaron Schweitzer, your host, with the mentally gymnastic co-hostess Laurel Bronze. This podcast is powered by The Source Weekly, Bend's locally owned newspaper. Listeners tune in to find out how our community is adapting to living in our new normal. This week, we are chatting with Dr. Sabrina Hadeed-Duea. She is a licensed professional counselor, an approved clinical supervisor, and a counselor educator. She earned her Ph.D. in counseling with a major in counselor education and supervision from Oregon State University. She has experience in wilderness therapy, crisis intervention, individual and family work, and currently runs the group practice Bend Ecotherapy remotely. Dr. Hadeed-Duea also currently teaches as an adjunct professor for Montana State University's online graduate addiction counseling program and for Oregon State University Cascades graduate counseling program as well. Currently, OSU Cascades is offering free telehealth counseling services to adults in Central Oregon through its student clinic. We will put the link for that opportunity in the show notes at the end. Thank you for joining us, Sabrina.
Thank you for having me. You're welcome.
So let's start off with your background in wilderness therapy. I imagine integrating nature into the counseling experience is something that people in Bend are drawn to. And what are some of the direct connections between psychological health and the outdoors that you see in your practice?
Mm-hmm. Oh my goodness. So the list is long. I mean, simply put, there are health benefits overall, sort of holistic health benefits to being outdoors in nature. It can decrease high blood pressure. It can, there are studies that show that it decreases risk of heart disease. Just breathing fresh air can be really helpful for stress reducing, vitamin D from the sun. Movement in the outdoors, moving your body can also, decrease stress and increase healthy blood flow. And so the link really is decreasing stress helps with mental health across the board. I mean, I think everybody can relate to that. The less stress that we feel, the more relaxed we feel, the better able we are to manage stress and manage, other challenges in our life. So I think the most direct link is just that being outside, even if you're stationary, can really help you feel more relaxed, and that directly impacts how you feel.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask you is, Bend is full of the outdoor overachiever. And but you're saying that even if I were simply to schedule in some time to stand out in the, well, it would be snow today, but stand out in the sunlight or breathe in the fresh air, that would be enough to enjoy some of the mental health benefits that the outdoors brings.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, especially right now, because we're spending more time, since the start of the pandemic. I think people have certainly gotten creative about how they can break up the monotony of just every day kind of being at home, if you're working remotely in particular, teaching kids at home, things like that. So I think we've gotten creative, but it's still just not as much as, at least that's what I'm experiencing, not just myself, but that I'm hearing from clients, is that they're just not spending as much time outside because everything is harder. And I know we'll maybe spend a little time talking about that later, but, you have to plan around whether or not there's going to be parking. I know people that usually go up to Bachelor, that's just been harder because of the pandemic and the restrictions. And so even just making it a point every day to make sure that you're stepping outside, we're not going to the store as much. We're not going to the coffee shops. We're not leaving our house, walking to our car, getting out of our car, walking to this next place. We're missing all of those small moments outside that matter. So the commitment to spending time outdoors doesn't have to be great and grand and a well planned out adventure. It can just be step outside, feel the wind on your face, the sun or snow.
Yeah. I'm certainly one of those people. I think, kudos to my wife. She makes me at least walk outside, even if I can't, because I'm one of those people, and I think I fall in the Bend category. If I can't think of the activity that is going to happen after work, then outside is not going to happen. It's got to be the to-do list for exercise or improvement or whatever it's going to be.
That's right. It's a very common phenomenon, this having to feel productive when being outside, or even productive, I call it productive rest. People struggle with this notion of that rest, that stillness can be really productive.
Yeah. We interviewed you for a couple of articles over the past year about mental health in the time of COVID, and it's actually what gave birth to this podcast at its core. And one of the themes we discussed was COVID burnout. And when we published the article, it was only a couple months in, and it seems like we're now over a year. Can you describe, what does COVID burnout look like now, and how has it deepened or changed?
Yeah, it's such a good question. I really appreciate the question of how it's changed or how it's deepened. I think how I've seen it change for a lot of folks, how they're experiencing it, is similar, but more, I think, more intense, if that makes sense. So like in the beginning of the pandemic, I think, a lot of people were experiencing this, hopelessness, or sort of like the burnout of the unknown, burnout of uncertainty. We didn't know a lot about, how long are we going to be in this? Is this a 3-month endurance battle, or is this longer? And how bad is this really? There was so much unknown that burnout from that, the burnout from uncertainty, and decision fatigue. I know we talked about that in that previous interview, was much more on the surface. And now I think the shift is what I would call sort of the hope despair roller coaster, where people are finding things to be hopeful about. Like, some folks are hopeful about the vaccine. Folks are hopeful about just, we've been in it long enough that we have systems in place that are helping address some of the earlier barriers. So, sort of being creative with how we socialize with others, rather than feeling like we can't at all.
Sure.
Things like that. But then despair, I think I'm seeing just sadness, frustration, fatigue, feeling like everything's harder, is also still really present for people. And it's, I think, it's similar to running a race where you don't know where the finish line is. It's when we see an end in sight, we're much more likely psychologically to be motivated to finish the race, no matter how hard it is.
Right.
But if we can't see the finish line, where's the motivation to keep going? And so it goes back and forth, I think, with people. I spend a lot of time talking to clients about one day at a time, just taking it one day at a time, one moment at a time, and normalizing the struggle. The hashtag "the struggle is real" is so right, is so right on. I mean, it is real.
Yeah.
And I mean, those are my thoughts about kind of how the burnout has changed.
I used an analogy in one of the previous podcasts where it feels sometimes like I'm walking next to folks who are, it's like the person when you're going on the hike up the mountain, and they're always pointing out that they think like just up ahead is the summit. I think that's the summit. And you get there and it's a false, and it's like, oh, I think that's the summit. And you're just on this, like, we'll get to the summit in good time, but you're killing me.
Yeah, totally.
So
That's such a good example. Yeah. It's like, distractions from looking for the finish line, because we just don't know where it is. And for a lot of folks, the final thing about how it's shifted, burnout's shifted, is that things have gotten easier for some and harder for some, much harder for some. People that have been unemployed and receiving unemployment benefits, those benefits have run out, or people that thought they'd be able to go back to work, but weren't, because companies downsized or went out of business, or they're still not comfortable putting their kids in school, and so they're not able to go back to work, even though their work is, welcoming them back with COVID precautions. So it's, the burnout is also from those struggles as well.
Sure.
Yeah.
So adding to that culture of burnout has also been, I think, a year of like a lot of heightened judgment and moralizing. And I know that at least I have felt a little more on edge and sort of scared that maybe I'm going to do or say the wrong thing, or forget a mask, or get canceled or condemned on some level. I was wondering if you could talk about like what you're seeing out there with, a lot of like cultural shifts and things that are happening now too.
Oh, absolutely. I think the judgment culture is a good way to put it. I think across the board, almost everyone that I work with is experiencing just fatigue of judgment, and it's not just coming from external forces like other people, or messages. It's coming from internally. It's coming from their own judgment. Kind of second guessing decisions that they've made. I think that there. I mean, we know as a nation, there's a lot of polarizing happening. There's a lot of like us and them, or this side and that side. And it's really hard. That's a really hard reality. It's not, one, it's not realistic, because we don't live in a world where you fall into this category or that category. We are human beings, and we exist on a spectrum of, beautiful complexity. And so I think, part of this judgment culture that comes from sort of like this duality is really problematic for people. And it's everywhere. It's not just, judgment about how the precautions you're taking for COVID. It's also judgment about whether or not it's vaccine judgment, right? Whether or not you are willing to get the vaccine, going to get the vaccine, and then judgment around if you're eligible for the vaccine, you know, but you can work from home. Does that mean you shouldn't go get it? Choices about kids, putting your kids back in school or not putting your kids back in school, being an educator and being on the fence about whether you think it's safe to go back. And, you have the administration telling you that you're allowed to and that they want you to. And so the judgment is just, it's so complex and it's so real for people. And imagine, feeling judgment from all angles, how exhausting that is mentally, and how it can impact every aspect of your life. So, feeling judged at work, or feeling judged by family members you don't live with, or even friends. I have heard so many folks talk about losing friends because of, choices that they're making that are pandemic related. And now we're talking about grief as well. I'm grieving the loss of my my good friends that are also my neighbors, because they saw me not wear a mask one day when I was talking to someone else, or
Right.
I posted something about getting a vaccine and they don't agree with. It's super complex.
Do you think that, one of the things that I've noticed over the course of time with this is that people, and maybe this is because we did get so polarized under the previous administration, but it was just very easy to identify with your political party. And a lot of your friends fell into that political party characterization. And I've seen people really struggling as, the pandemic has gone forward, because this is a health related issue. And while some of the issues can be focused around politics, really, when you start talking to it, these are very personal choices. They're things that come from a very deep value system that you probably got from your parents, or hopefully from your readings and stuff. But either way, what I see is this struggle with people in a gray area where, they can't assign it to a blue or a red, and they're like, well, where do you stand? Are you quote conservative about COVID? And it just doesn't fit for me. And I think I've seen, in the same way you have, a lot of friends who are just kind of puzzling as they hear conflicting ideas for their own system, which they believe is based in a political party.
Yeah. Yeah, that's absolutely right. Yeah. And I think people are afraid, people are, they're living in fear, even if it's, again, at different degrees of fear. Sure. Based on your life situation, and identity in the world. But there's just a pulse of fear for everybody, afraid to say the wrong thing, afraid if they, signal about a political. I had a new neighbor come over the other day that was wearing an Obama hat, and I noticed the hat out loud and made a statement about it, and the person said, I almost didn't wear it over because you just never know. And I thought, oh, like what a world we're living in right now, where we're worried about the kind of hat signaling. Or the other thing that's happening with that I've observed social justice related is, this really exciting, beautifully complex idea of being really loud and let's get loud and let's, be bold. And then there are folks that don't feel comfortable being loud, or it's not
Right.
safe to be loud, and they're making choices about that. And then there comes the judgment again, or just feeling like you're not good enough, right? These cognitive beliefs that we all have that can be really damaging. Like I'm not enough, or it's my fault. Things like that. I'm hearing just a lot of that, and feeling guilty, and um, it's
Well,
layered.
that brings us to another question about impacts of isolation. And, we're all like we are right now, we're Zooming, and Laurel and I have many times talked about what the difference between this podcast would be if we were all sitting around a table and we were having an adult beverage or whatever it was that turned it into more of a social
Mhm.
thing, instead of the fact that we're separated by a camera as we are in all these meetings. And what are you seeing from people in terms of how they're dealing with that long-term isolation? I mean, we all know it's not good, but I think it's hard for people outside of your field to understand, like, really how impactful it is.
Oh my goodness, it is probably the number one most difficult circumstance that people are struggling with right now. And again, I know I keep using the word spectrum, but of course there's differing degrees, and it's just a
Sure.
spectrum of how people experience isolation. And one thing to notice that isolation isn't just as you both know, isolation isn't just about like someone that lives alone, right, or someone that's confined to their room because they're in assisted living, or something like that. You can feel isolated with your six family members. You can feel isolated even though you've got your sort of safe pod. I think people are actually getting to know what it means to feel disconnected and isolated differently than we ever had. Um, and so it's coming up for a lot of people, and I spend a lot of time talking about ways to get creative to challenge that, even if it is as similar to the outdoor conversation of just being stationary outside. Having some interpersonal contact every day becomes really important outside your immediate circle, right? So not just your family members, because everyone knows we get really sick of the people that we see day after day. It's important to break away from that, and it's safe to do that at a distance, masked up, outside. All the different guidelines, and so just really challenging yourself to do that. And knowing that, and here's the thing too that I always say, is that everyone else is experiencing this. So chances are, and I've experienced this in my neighborhood, people are much more eager to chat when I walk down the street than they were a year ago.
Oh yeah, no, the breakthrough that you can have when you just simply call somebody up who's a client or someone you have
Yeah,
just a moderate relationship, and the outpouring of emotion that comes through for connecting with somebody for, I don't
yeah,
know, maybe it's their first time in weeks, who knows?
yeah, yeah, for sure. So just little ways to challenge that, I think, has been helpful. But and knowing you're not alone. I mean, this is the new normal, that expression. I mean, people are across the board feeling really isolated, and some people much harder than others. If you're
Yeah.
immunocompromised, if you're elderly, I mean, if you just you know for whatever reason you're not able to get creative with being less isolated, or what I'm seeing is an underlying, if you started out already having problems with social anxiety, if you started out already having problems with isolation, it has become so much harder and so much more important to find those little ways to break that isolation.
So, on that vein of thought, it's been pretty amazing to watch mental health professionals just dive in with both feet into telehealth. And I think I read an article that something like 75% are practicing telehealth now, up from maybe 5 or 10% before. So, could you talk a little bit about some of the both benefits and the challenges for clients and mental health professionals?
Absolutely. Yeah. So one of the courses I teach actually this term at OSU is has the focus of telehealth.
Oh yeah, I'm in that. I should
Which you're in.
disclose.
Full disclosure.
Full
That's right.
disclosure.
Yep, that's right. That's exactly right. Um, so I've taken a deep dive into learning more about telehealth and understanding the ins and outs, the issues, the barriers, the ways that it's helpful. I think my biggest takeaways are, telehealth is it's always been, even before the pandemic, a really great way for people that have access, that have a computer, that have internet access, to make it to sessions, when maybe before it wasn't as easy, to just log onto your computer and show up. And so I think that that's been really helpful for folks, especially being in a pandemic where you don't feel like it's safe to be in person. So you're able to get continue to meet with your therapist, or even, get a new therapist, because now you're under more stress and you're struggling just like everybody is. The uptick of need for services has been incredible. So I think the biggest benefit is access. And it's also one of the biggest barriers because, as we know, we live in a world where not everybody has access. And so that's been, a struggle. I think even for, I can't speak specifically for OSU Clinic, but I know, in talking with students that at the beginning of the pandemic, that was really hard to sort of know how they were going to meet clients' needs that are already, either don't have insurance or, can't afford out-of-pocket counseling, how they would have access. I think the other biggest struggle with telehealth is in adolescents and kids, little kids. We could have done play therapy in the office much more easily before the pandemic. And now those kids are having to do it online, and therapists are really having to stretch to find creative ways to do. I mean, how do you do? Nobody got training, even if you're certified play therapist, there wasn't really training in how to do play therapy online, how to work with kids in a telehealth setting. Their attention span and concentration, we know this, anybody that has little kids knows that it's just, they're not able to focus for long periods of time, even in an office, let alone on a computer. And the burnout from being on, computer for adults. People, I often say, like, I just didn't want to get on another Zoom call. I just didn't want to have another video conference. And then the final thought I have is, I had actually a student ask me a couple weeks ago, what was the thing that I missed the most when, in offering telehealth, doing telehealth now for quite some time. And I said that it was the energy exchange that comes with being in person. There's an energy exchange. We know this. And eye contact. We also know that eye contact is really important for the chemicals in our brain to be stimulated, and for, all of those neurons to fire up. We're not getting that. I mean, we have eye contact in the remote world, but it's just not the same.
Like, you can't pick up, I'm a gesticulator. You can't see that up here if I'm talking to you down here. Like, that's that energy. It just doesn't come through.
Totally. Which, it's Erin, it's a perfect example. I've learned how, and I talk about this in the class, I've learned how to really be intentional with how I move on a canvas.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Or, I put my hands on my heart more so than I did before.
Yeah.
I'll take deep breaths much more audibly. I'll lean forward. I'll lean back. I'll check in, with people differently than I would in person. Because it is hard. It's hard to read. Like, are you tearful? I mean, it looks like maybe you're tearful, right? And are you tearful right now versus being in person, or even noticing, somebody getting flushed, from anxiety. Some of those nonverbal, more subtle things we miss in telehealth. So just kind of learning how to check in with that.
After seeing that, I need to start incorporating more of that above camera hand messaging. Laurel, you take note. That's podcast stuff too.
There you go. Yeah.
Well, one of the, changing the topic a little bit, interesting trend that's emerged during COVID is the pivot. Everybody likes to talk about what's their pivot or what's the change that's happened to them during this time. What are they doing now? Are they writing the great American novel? Are they, now a yogi expert that nobody knows about in their playroom? And, but, is there, I've wondered, one, is this going to hold after we get back to old normal? And two, is it a healthy sign that, as things kind of quieted, slowed down, that, I mean, you can see that frantic kind of, it's not just a Bend thing, but it's certainly prevalent here with the type A's of like, hey, something's got to fill this void. What are your thoughts on that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that it serves a really healthy purpose, to have something to put energy into. I know I've experienced that since the pandemic, like this feeling of, I want something to kind of pour my energy into because I don't have these other things. So in some ways it's really healthy, to start writing that novel you always wanted to write, or,
Right.
to get one of those 1,000-piece puzzles that you hadn't done since you were whatever younger, to remodel your bathroom. I mean, house remodeling projects have like tripled and quadrupled since the pandemic.
Yeah, well, for the record, I tried the puzzle and it was not fulfilling. So I'm not saying go down that road.
Totally. Yeah, I think it's really natural and normal, to want to have something to kind of, energetically put your heart into, or even use it as a distraction. I know some folks have gotten into crossword puzzles again, which is great. And I also, think that some people struggle with just being in stillness and just quiet, sort of slowing down. And for the type, like you said, type A folks, that's harder. It's particularly harder. And I want to normalize it. Like, it's so individualized for people. It's really important to remember that as a practitioner, I try to stay away from generalizations, even about type A people, because every type A person is going to be different. And the conversation I would want to have with somebody that maybe comes, to me as a client and says, well, I'm really struggling with the balance in my life. Like, I just want, I just want to be doing more, and I just don't feel like I'm doing more. I would probably start to talk about what is that about for them? What does it mean to them to be productive? What does it mean to them to rest? When was it, what's the longest period of time that you can go without having a distraction? And for some people, it's really important that they not go long periods of time, because it helps offset depression, or it helps, offset, whatever it is, a spike in anxiety. So in some ways it can be really adaptive to constantly have something to do. And I don't know, I mean, I think it's easy to judge whether to say, well, that's not healthy, but it's different for everybody. For right now, it might be the healthiest thing to just
Sure.
stay occupied and distracted and stay the course. And for others,
And try not to go into that quiet place where you might actually think about what's happening.
right, like maybe that's helpful, right? Yeah.
Right.
So you have a brother who had one of the rare cases of H1N1 and had to be put on a ventilator. This was a number of years ago. How has that experience affected your response to COVID?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I think in a number of ways. The first thing that comes to mind that kind of made me smile was that when when COVID first began, sort of last March, mid to end of March, I think I sent my brother a text message that said, well, brother, at least you don't have to take precautions, because what are the chances that you would get COVID after almost dying of H1N1? You're in the clear. I made some kind of joke, so it was certainly on my mind, from the beginning. Was like, we went through, I mean, it was it was torture with my brother. He was given less than a 10% chance to live. He was in a medically induced coma for 16 days, I think. up in Seattle in a hospital there. And, he's a young guy, no underlying conditions, all the things that you hear that are outliers. He shouldn't have gotten that sick, but he did. And the thing I almost get choked up thinking about it, because the thing that has been so powerful for me personally, and even my family during this pandemic, is just the reality that when my brother was sick with H1N1, we were allowed to stay in the hospital. We lived in that waiting room. We went home to sleep, and then we just lived. We had set up camp. We have photos of people bringing potluck, and there was a gathering that happened. We prayed together. We sang together. We cried together. We went and spoke to him, even though the doctor said, well, he probably can't hear you. We played music for him. We got to be as close to him and his process as one would want to be with someone they love. And COVID, we know that is not possible. And so my heart has been really impacted just thinking about how hard that is for people. And then healthcare workers as well. I still to this day have sent a thank you card every year to that hospital, to the ICU staff, and probably the staff has completely changed now, but just how grateful we were for just round the clock care that he had. And so that, when I see people appreciating healthcare workers, for me, it's it touches back to what my brother went through and how much harder it is, because the healthcare workers themselves don't have the capacity. They don't, they're working much harder than they did. Like with my brother, they got to go home and socialize with their people. They got to do the activities to take care of themselves, to restore balance. The healthcare workers, right now are facing the same challenges we are. They don't have as much access to self-care. So those, yeah.
Dr. Duea, we're almost out of time, but I wanted to ask you what's the most important thing that people can do for their own mental health right now, if you had to pick the top one or two preservation techniques?
Honestly, I would say have grace with yourself, have compassion with yourself, treat yourself the way that you treat the person in your life that you love the most. Have patience and grace, and remind yourself you're doing the best that you can. That's the thing I say over and over every week in almost every session. And I believe it.
Well, thank you for joining us on the podcast. I really appreciate you taking the time. This has been the Bend Don't Break podcast. We appreciate you listening, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.